The neon sign above Meadowlane Diner buzzed faintly as rain danced on the windows, painting streaks of color across the chrome and vinyl interior. Inside, Sarah moved with quiet precision through the half-empty room, balancing a tray of chipped mugs and greasy plates like a seasoned performer. The graveyard shift had long since stripped her of illusions, but not of her dignity. Her uniform was ironed, her hair tied back neatly, and her smile, though often tired, never failed to reach her eyes. She greeted each late-night trucker student and loner with warmth, even as the soles of her shoes wore thin and her car parked at the edge of the lot doubled as her home. Nobody at the diner knew she lived in that faded sedan, angled carefully between the dumpster and a dark corner where the security camera didn't reach, and Sarah intended to keep it that way. Her life was a delicate balance, enough shifts to eat and keep gas in the tank, but never quite enough to afford first month's rent. When the rent at her last shared apartment rose without warning, she'd packed everything into the trunk and quietly transitioned to survival mode. Still, Sarah didn't allow her hardships to sour her spirit. On slow nights, she slipped extra hash browns onto a regular's plate or brewed a fresh pot of coffee for the elderly man who sat reading the same newspaper every week. When families came in and counted their change, before ordering, she'd find a way to discount something without alerting Rick, the night manager, whose sense of compassion was buried under years of bitterness and corporate indifference. Rick ran the shift like a petty tyrant, critiquing everything from the syrup bottle's placement to how Sarah folded napkins. But she kept her head down, absorbing it all like weather. Unpleasant, but temporary. It was just past 11:30 on a Tuesday night when the bell above the door jingled and a stranger stepped in, soaked from the storm. He wasn't the usual type, no duffel bag, no road weariness. He looked about 40, average height, sharp eyes. A plain jacket clung to his frame, and in one hand he held a leather-bound notebook now speckled with rain. Sarah met his gaze and smiled the same way she greeted everyone and gestured to the booths. "Anywhere you like," she called. He chose the corner booth, unpopular because of the wobbly table, and sat without removing his jacket. She brought him a menu and a wrapped set of utensils, her voice soft but steady. "Coffee?" she asked. He nodded black. There was something different about him. Not threatening, just present. Most customers barely noticed her, but this man met her eyes with full attention. As she poured his coffee into a heavy ceramic mug, one of the few original touches left from when Meadowlane was still a family-run diner, she caught sight of his hands. They were clean but calloused in a way that suggested he wasn't afraid of work. There was a scar across one knuckle, subtle but old. He thanked her for the coffee and began writing in his notebook, pausing now and then to look around the diner with deliberate interest. Sarah didn't pry. Boundaries were one of the few dignities she had left, and she extended the same courtesy to others, but curiosity tugged at her. He didn't scroll through a phone, didn't order anything else, just sipped and watched. 20 minutes passed, and still he remained scribbling occasionally as the room emptied out. On a whim, perhaps one driven by weariness, or the simple need to offer something good in a world that had offered her so little, Sarah sliced into the cherry pie. It was still made from her mother's original recipe, back when she had worked at Meadowlane decades ago. She added a generous scoop of vanilla ice cream and carried it to the man's table. On the house, she said with a shrug, "You look like you could use something sweet after being out in that storm." He looked up surprised. "That's very kind," he replied. "It's just pie," she said quickly. But they both knew it wasn't about dessert. It was about seeing someone and acknowledging their discomfort. That small gesture, so routine for her, felt like a moment of real connection. She didn't know this man's story, and she certainly didn't know that he was Jacob Hale, CEO of Meadowlane Diners, sitting quietly to witness what his brand had become. Jacob watched her return behind the counter, pouring coffee for another table, wiping down surfaces with methodical care. He saw the weariness in her shoulders, the way she moved with someone else's burdens stacked on her back. Yet she smiled. Not the plastic customer service kind, but something gentler, deeper. As he took his first bite of the pie, his pen paused over his notebook. He had come looking for signs of decay, of why his father's legacy had eroded into profit-driven apathy. But what he'd found instead was something rarer: quiet resilience disguised in an apron and hiding behind a tired smile. And Sarah, utterly unaware, had just stepped into a chapter of her life. She couldn't yet imagine Jacob Hale return the next night, just after 11:30, stepping into the now familiar warmth of Meadowlane Diner, his notebook tucked under one arm and the scent of rain still clinging to his jacket. He didn't wait for Sarah to offer a seat. This time he slid into the same corner booth, now a quiet perch from which he could observe the rhythms of the graveyard shift. It was a worn but loyal place, much like the diner itself. The red vinyl seats had cracks along the seams, and the overhead bulbs still flickered above the bathroom door. But Jacob wasn't looking at decor, he was watching people. More specifically, he was watching Sarah. Not in a leering or curious way, but with the attentive eye of someone trained to see what others overlooked. Each night she moved with purpose, clearing tables before customers asked, refilling coffee, just before a hand rose, comforting regulars with the ease of someone who genuinely remembered their stories. And always she gave just a little more than required: an extra ladle of soup, a smile, a shared joke. His notes became more focused. He catalogued her interactions not as a surveillance exercise, but as a map of dignity drawn in small gestures. Sarah wasn't aware of how closely he was studying her, or if she was, she gave no sign. The anonymity of her station had long since taught her to ignore wandering eyes, but gradually the wall between them began to shift. It started with shared lines of humor, Jacob making a dry comment about the flickering bulb and Sarah chuckling in agreement. "It's been threatening to go out for 6 months. Their conversations slowly ventured deeper. One night, over a refill of black coffee, Jacob asked almost casually, "Did you always want to work in a diner?" Sarah hesitated before replying. Her voice was even, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "I was supposed to start culinary school the fall after my mum got diagnosed. She said had a partial scholarship, but cancer doesn't care about scholarships." The words lingered between them. She confessed that she had deferred her dreams for caretaking, for survival, for paying hospital bills no young woman should have to face alone. "I used to cook," she said one night, staring at the dessert case as if it held memories. "Now I just serve." Jacob didn't push her further. He didn't need to. He knew the weight of sacrifices made too early, of dreams placed on the shelf while life demanded more urgent things. But he was beginning to understand that Sarah's strength wasn't just in what she'd endured, it was in what she continued to give. In the face of constant struggle, she never turned bitter. Her kindness was not performative, not a strategy to earn tips or praise. It was instinctual. And increasingly, Jacob found himself wondering what it might look like if that kind of heart led the culture of his entire company. Then came the night that would shift everything. The diner was quieter than usual, the rain outside giving way to a thick silence. Sarah was behind the counter, preparing a to-go box for a homeless man who often hovered by the back alley, when a crash echoed from the kitchen. Plates shattered. A sharp intake of breath followed. Jacob looked up from his notes in time to see Noah, the teenage dishwasher, crouched on the tile hands, trembling as he gathered broken pieces. Blood was already welling from a cut on his palm. Rick, the night manager, stood over him with a sneer. "That's coming out of your check," he barked. "Maybe if you weren't daydreaming about your little video games, this wouldn't happen." Noah mumbled an apology, eyes wide with fear. No one moved. Sarah did. Without hesitation, she pushed through the kitchen door. "Leave him alone." "Rick," she said, her voice steady. "It was an accident, and you can't legally dock his pay for it. That's wage theft." Rick's face flushed. "You want to tell me how to run my shift," he growled, but Sarah didn't back down. "It's not your shift, and if someone from corporate actually gave a damn, they'd be ashamed to see you bully a kid." The room froze. Jacob's pen hovered above the page, unmoving. He had come looking for data, for culture red flags, for trends in customer experience. What he found was something far rarer: Raw integrity under fire. Sarah crouched beside Noah, gently guiding him away from the broken shards. "Let's get your hand cleaned," she murmured. "You're not in trouble." The moment passed, but the echo of it remained. Back at his booth, Jacob slowly closed his notebook. His coffee had gone cold, but he didn't care. Sarah had just made a choice that cost her nothing, and yet everything. In an environment where silence meant survival, she had spoken up for a teenage boy, for fairness, for decency. As he watched her move across the room with her usual calm, even as tension simmered from Rick's fury, Jacob realized this diner wasn't broken because of corporate missteps or outdated policies. It had simply forgotten its soul, and that soul he was beginning to believe might be wrapped in an apron and carrying a coffee pot with a scar on her heart but fire in her spine. It started with a family quiet, polite, worn thin by life, but holding tightly to their Friday night tradition. The Rodriguez family had been coming to Meadowlane Diner twice a month when Mr. Rodriguez got paid, and Sarah always recognized the effort it took for them to sit down for a meal together. That evening, their youngest daughter, Elena, pointed to the dessert case with wide, hopeful eyes. "Mama, look at the pretty red pie," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah could tell from Mrs. Rodriguez's gentle shake of the head that pie was not in the budget tonight. She'd seen that look before parents, weighing sweetness against necessity. And without thinking twice, Sarah did what she always did when the world was unfair in small but painful ways. She cut 5 slices of cherry pie, added swirls of whipped cream, and carried them to the table. On the house, she said brightly, "We're trying a new recipe. We need taste testers." The children's faces lit up with delight, and even Mr. Rodriguez, usually so reserved, smiled in genuine gratitude. But kindness in Rick's world was currency poorly spent. The moment Sarah stepped back behind the counter, she felt his presence looming. Mitchell office. Now his voice carried across the diner like a crack of thunder. She followed him into the cramped office, ignoring the curious glances from customers and staff alike. Rick didn't bother to close the door. "That's 5 slices of our signature dessert," he snapped, slamming open a drawer and yanking out a stack of paperwork. "That's company property you just gave away." Again. Sarah stood still, hands at her sides. "It builds loyalty," she replied evenly. "They'll come back." "You don't tell me how to run a business," he barked. "You live in your car and you're out here handing away food like you're running a soup kitchen." The words stung, not for their cruelty, but for their exposure. Her secret dragged into fluorescent light. Rick waved the termination paperwork like a weapon. "You're done. Sign this." Sarah stared at the papers, then looked him straight in the eye, and something inside her shifted. 3 years of swallowed words and bent backs crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. She took off her apron, slowly folded it with care, and set it on the desk beside her name tag. "You know what? Rick, fire me. But I'm not signing anything that says I stole. I've never taken a penny. The only thing I've ever given away is decency." He scoffed, turning red. "You're ungrateful." "Also," she continued calmly, "you should know the cherry pie recipe. It wasn't Meadowlane's idea. My mother created it. She worked here 20 years ago, so technically I was just sharing a family recipe." A hush had fallen outside the office. Carlos stood by the counter, and even a couple of customers had stopped mid-bite to listen. Sarah walked out without flinching, past the Rodriguez family, and gave Elena a soft smile. "Enjoy your pie," she said. "Some things are worth more than their price." The rain had stopped when she stepped outside, but the parking lot glistened under the lamplight. Sarah walked toward her car, the exhaustion of the confrontation clinging to her shoulders like wet clothes. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the door, but before she got in, something caught her eye, an envelope tucked beneath her windshield wiper. No name on the front, just a clean white fold placed with care. Inside was a letter on official Meadowlane Diners letterhead, the company logo faint but unmistakable. Her eyes moved down the page and froze at the signature Jacob Hale, CEO. Her breath caught. The words that followed unraveled her every assumption. Jacob apologized for the mismanagement she'd endured, for the conditions allowed to fester beneath his watch. He praised her commitment, her ethics, her strength under pressure, and then he offered something she had never dared to imagine. Enclosed was a key to an apartment unit, 204 at Riverside Complex, paid for 3 months in advance. Alongside it, a prepaid company card with $3,000 and no strings attached. Whether you choose to continue with Meadowlane is your decision. The letter said, but please know this is not a reward, it's a recognition. Sarah read it twice, her heart thudding against her ribs. Beneath the key was a business card. Jacob Hale. CEO, personal number included, and suddenly everything made sense. The notebook. The quiet presence. The questions that felt too precise. Jacob had seen her, not just as a server, not just as a face behind a counter, but as a person. The weight of the day hit her all at once, being fired, exposing Rick, losing her only income. And yet, as she sat in her car, clutching that key, she didn't feel despair. She felt something else, something rare, relief. She didn't drive to the apartment that night. She wasn't ready. Instead, she parked behind a 24-hour laundromat. She knew Wells stared at the envelope in her lap and turned the key over in her palm again and again. The storm inside her was still raging, but in the distance, for the first time in a long while, she sensed the sky beginning to clear. Tomorrow she would decide her next move, but tonight she would let herself breathe for the first time, not as a waitress, barely scraping by, but as someone who had been seen, truly seen and acknowledged. Not pitied, not rescued, but valued. 2 days passed before Sarah made the call. The envelope Jacob had left still sat on her dashboard, alongside the letter that had shaken the foundation of everything she thought she knew about her job and about the man she'd served cherry pie to under a stormy sky. When she dialed his number, her hands were steady, though her voice caught slightly when he answered. Jacob didn't waste time with pleasantries. I meant every word in that letter, he told her, but I'd rather say it in person. They met in a nearby park, neutral ground, as Sarah had requested. Jacob arrived in a button-down shirt and jeans, not a tailored suit. He came not as a CEO, but as a man trying to make things right. Over 2 coffees from a vendor cart, he explained his vision. A Meadowlane that returned to its roots, built not on stock prices and efficiency metrics, but on real hospitality. Real people. And respect. He didn't just want Sarah's insight, he wanted her leadership. The offer was clear, a salaried position as Regional Culture and Operations Advisor. Total autonomy over her home location authority to implement staff training, revise protocols, and create a space where workers weren't just cogs in a wheel, but respected contributors. You'd work directly with me. Jacob said to rebuild everything we lost. Sarah didn't answer right away. She asked for 1 more day alone. That afternoon she drove an hour out of town to the quiet cemetery where her mother was buried. Kneeling beside the simple headstone, she ran her fingers across the engraved name, Margaret Ellen Mitchell. You always told me service meant dignity, Sarah whispered. Not just for the customers, but for yourself too. She spoke to her mother as if she were still there, explaining Jacob's offer, her fears and the weight of being given something she didn't think she deserved. When she rose from the grave, her decision was made. She called Jacob that night and said yes, with conditions. I'll do it. She told him, but only if it means real change. I want to start a staff education fund, culinary training, financial literacy, college prep, and I want final say on hiring and scheduling at my location. No symbolic role, no token leadership. I need authority that matters. Jacob didn't hesitate. Done. The next morning, a memo went out across the Meadowlane system, announcing a restructuring of regional leadership. Rick, along with several other managers reported for mistreatment or poor ethics, was terminated. Effective immediately, Sarah's old diner was closed for 1 week to undergo renovations, not just in tiles and lighting, but in values. The toxic air that once hung in the break room was replaced by the smell of fresh paint, and cautious optimism. Carlos was promoted to head chef. May the once shy hostess became assistant manager while finishing her business degree. Noah received his first proper training schedule. No more dishwashing without breaks. No more verbal abuse. Sarah's first day in her new role didn't come with fanfare. No press releases or photo ops, just her a clipboard and a quiet determination. She started with conversations one-on-ones with every staff member. What did they need? What had been missing? The answers weren't surprising: fairness, safety, flexibility, and most of all, a reason to care. She implemented new scheduling policies that prioritized rest and consistency. She organized weekly training sessions that didn't just teach technical skills, but emphasized emotional intelligence, leadership, and community. She replaced outdated posters on the walls with framed photographs of past employees and handwritten stories about their contributions. Her mother's picture included the diner slowly transformed, not just aesthetically, but spiritually. And as customer satisfaction climbed, so did the morale. No more false smiles, no more walking on eggshells. Meadowlane was becoming a place people were proud to work in again. Jacob visited often, but not to micromanage. He watched from a distance, always with his notebook now used to capture stories and ideas rather than failures. One afternoon he sat in what had once been his undercover booth and watched Sarah train a new hire on the art of genuine table service. "It's not just about asking what they want," she explained. "It's about reading what they need, even if they don't say it out loud." He wrote that down. Afterward, he pulled her aside and handed her a folder. "6 more locations want to implement your staff development model," he said. "Are you ready?" Sarah smiled, a glimmer of excitement sparking behind her eyes. "Let's take it one diner at a time." 6 months later, Meadowlane's quarterly reports looked different. Revenue was climbing, but more importantly, so was retention staff, satisfaction, and community reputation. Sarah had built something more powerful than a system. She'd built a culture, one that remembered its roots in care and generosity. As she stood by the dessert case, now updated with her mother's original pie recipe, credited on a brass plaque beneath it, she felt something settle inside her. Not pride exactly, something softer. Fulfillment leadership, she had learned, wasn't about being in charge. It was about what you were willing to protect and what you refused to ignore. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah Mitchell wasn't just surviving. She was building something worth standing for. 6 months after the day she walked away from Rick's office with her apron in hand and her dignity intact, Sarah stood at the entrance of Meadowlane Diner and took in the quiet hum of a space reborn. The chrome fixtures gleamed beneath soft lighting, the reupholstered red vinyl booths welcomed guests with comfort, and the aroma of freshly baked pastries mingled with sizzling bacon. But it wasn't the decor, or even the improved menu that made this diner thrive. It was the people behind the counter. Carlos prepped a new seasonal special with confidence. In the dining area, Noah greeted guests while sporting his newly earned line cook badge. May now coordinated the afternoon shifts and proudly kept a business textbook tucked in her bag. The staff felt seen, respected, and with every smile they exchanged and every order they delivered, Sarah knew they were creating more than meals. They were building trust, belonging, and a new way forward. Sarah's days had become a carefully orchestrated balance. She opened the diner, most mornings reviewed scheduling logs and inventory updates, then trained new hires on both technical skills and emotional intelligence, an approach rooted in empathy, not just efficiency. 3 evenings a week she left the diner just in time to make it across town to her culinary school classes, finally pursuing the dream she'd put on hold for so long. Tuition supplies, even her chef's uniform, were now covered by a Meadowlane scholarship initiative she had personally helped design. Her instructors noted her natural talent and deep understanding of flavors, but what set her apart was her purpose. Every dish she plated carried more than seasoning. It carried story memory and the quiet rebellion of someone who had chosen not to give up on herself. Back at the diner, the cherry pie had taken on a symbolic life of its own. It was no longer just a dessert. It was a reminder of what Meadowlane stood for now. A framed photo of Sarah's mother. Margaret hung above the dessert case, smiling from her days in uniform. Beside it, a simple brass plaque read, "Kindness isn't policy, it's legacy." Jacob had insisted on the inscription after overhearing Sarah say those very words during a particularly long team meeting about customer experience. The plaque became a touchstone for staff and customers alike. Visitors asked about it, and Sarah always told the story, not of herself, but of the woman who'd once worked quietly behind the counter and passed on a recipe that outlived her, a pie that had started revolutions in subtle, beautiful ways. One rainy Tuesday evening near closing time, a young woman entered the diner. Her clothes were damp, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion, and her fingers nervously counted the change in her coat pocket. "Just coffee, please," she said to the hostess, her voice barely audible. Sarah, observing from across the room, recognized that look. The weight of too many burdens, the ache of pretending everything was fine. She approached the table quietly, carrying not only a fresh cup of coffee, but a plate with a generous slice of cherry pie. "I didn't order." "This," the woman said, startled. "It's on the house," Sarah replied gently. "We're trying a new batch and could use a kind taster." The woman blinked, unsure whether to argue or accept, and as the first spoonful reached her lips, something in her face softened. Relief, gratitude, the smallest flicker of hope. As Sarah turned to leave the table, she caught Jacob's eye across the diner. He had come in late for their weekly operations meeting, notebook in hand, but his eyes now shone with something deeper than approval. It was recognition, the same look he had given her the night she offered him pie without knowing who he was. They nodded silently to each other. There was no need for words. In that moment, the diner wasn't just a business. It was a vessel, a place where stories healed, where kindness passed from one hand to another like heirloom china, delicate but enduring. Sarah had come full circle, not just surviving, but leading with heart, rebuilding a place she once thought had forgotten her, and in doing so, she proved what Jacob once said over a cup of black coffee. Some things are worth more than their price. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet strength in everyday kindness, then don't forget to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ. We uncover stories that go beyond the surface, stories about dignity, redemption, and the power of one small act to change everything. Like, comment, and share this video with someone who believes in second chances. And remember, sometimes the smallest gesture carries the greatest weight. Stay with us, because the next story might just be yours.